Hello, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Mengs, and I welcome you guys back to a new episode of Unit Analysis, the show where we take a look at units from Advanced Wars in great detail. And today, we are checking out the bread and butter of Advanced Wars, the tank. Probably the second most commonly deployed ground unit after the infantry. I would say that 90% of all of your matches in Advanced Wars are going to look like this after a few days. It's going to be infantry on one side, tanks, and maybe a recon here and there in Fog of War. Outside of Fog of War, it's pretty much just going to be infantry tank. The metagame is very tank-centric right now. I think it's been that way for a very long while. Most people like to open up tanks. And I think one of the reasons why the tank is so popular is because it is pretty much the standard bread and butter unit of Advanced Wars, but it is also kind of the perfect unit. It has everything that you need for it to be viable. It kind of combines all the features of a unit into one great package. First of all, it's relatively cheap. It only costs 7,000, so it is a natural unit to build in the early game. Say you have 9,000 income and 3 bases, which is pretty standard in most competitive matchups, for at least the majority of the early game, that is. You can build a tank into infantry, which is a very good build order. You can keep doing that for a very long time until you're comfortable with the amount of buildings that you capture, and then you can start diversifying into other kinds of units. But for a majority of the early game, it's going to be tanks on both sides. And as I said, this is a very realistic scenario of something that you might see in the early game. Again, you have tanks, you have infantry, you have buildings that needs to be captured, and again, maybe a recon in Fog of War. So knowing how to utilize tanks and knowing how tanks perform against each other and knowing when to take tank fights is going to be very important. In fact, I would say that most matches are decided within the first 10 days based on the first few tank encounters. So one thing about tanks is that, of course, the person who strikes first is going to win. Like with all mirror matchups, you know, the tanks do 55% damage to other tanks, so whoever can get in a shot first is going to be in a good position. But of course, there's just so much more to that, because in Advanced Wars, it's not just about one unit attacking the other, it's about, once I attack with this unit, what other unit will attack my unit? And that's something we're going to be focusing heavily on. We're going to be talking a lot about the tank versus tank matchup, because it is such an important one. But first, let's just take a look at some of the tank's basics, like we always do. So, the tank, it has a movement range of 6, so it is incredibly fast, which is very good. And additionally, it moves on treads, which is the best ground movement type. Treads can traverse plains without penalty, unless it's raining, of course, which is good because plains is by far the most common terrain type in Advanced Wars. It can even traverse woods relatively easily, only paying 2 movement cost per movement, so getting tanks into forests, not really that hard, and that's very good, especially in Fog of War. You're very reliant on getting them into forests to keep them hidden. And what's great about the tank is that it can also scout pretty well. It has a vision range of 3, so it doesn't need external scouting support to help it out. It helps to have a recon nearby, of course, but it's not necessary. You can just build tanks, and they'll usually be able to see what they want to see before they attack it. Of course, like, if you don't have any recons, it can be easy for your opponent to dance around their vision range. They can place tanks just on the outskirts of their range, but still, they're not blind on their own, which is incredibly nice. They also got a very nice reserve of fuel and ammo, 70 fuel, 9 shots, so they don't run out of fuel incredibly fast. They don't really need APCs. Most of the time, a tank will die before it runs out of ammo or fuel. It is, as I always say, in terms of these things, if you have a tank that runs out of ammo, if you have a tank with a blinking ammo portrait next to it, that means that tank has done a very good job. That means the tank has probably earned itself in many times over, so don't be worried about that. That is a sign of quality right there. So, let's take a look at how the tank performs against other units. As I said, the tank is extremely versatile, and it can attack pretty much almost any unit in the game, aside from some of the air units. It can even attack ships, which is kind of funny, though. It doesn't really do much damage to them. However, I would say most of the time what you'll find is that you'll send the tank out and you'll see some infantry. Now, you shouldn't always attack infantry in the early game because there's a chance a tank might be hiding in the background. But if you are out and you encounter infantry, most of the time you'll see them on plains. But if you encounter isolated infantry, of course you should take them out. Now, I know I said this at the start of every episode, but even though I'm playing max here, I am turning powers off, so there's no extra firepower involved. But the tank deals a baseline 75% damage against infantry if caught out on roads, which is actually more than the recon, and this is one of the reasons why most pro players tend to open up tank. Opening up recon is very rare in Advanced Wars, because the tank deals with infantry a little bit better than recons actually. And if the infantry are by themselves, of course, the tank will just demolish them. So very good for interrupting camps, for harassing enemy infantry, and even if you have a little bit of a firepower increase, the tank might even be able to break through infantry lines on roads. But again, that will require comm towers in Dual Strike or an Advanced Wars by Web or a power or something like that. The tank can even deal very well with mechs, and most of the time, since mechs are so limited in their mobility, this is far more likely than the mech getting to attack the tank. So if your opponent is building mechs to counter tanks, and you get to scout that, and you catch the mechs out in the open, which is pretty likely to happen, unless you got a map with a lot of forests and mountains, tanks will counter mechs most of the time. Mechs will not be able to do great against them if caught out in the open. Tanks also obliterate recons, dealing 85% damage to them, so the recons will not be able to survive for long. If you have a little bit of a firepower increase, there's a small chance you might actually get to one-shot them if they're out on roads, and recons do tend to be on roads a lot because they move on tires. So, of course, most pro players will try to end their movement on planes if they can, but it is not uncommon to catch recons on roads, and in that situation you will do a lot of damage to them. As we already established, tanks do 55% damage to each other in a mirror matchup, so most of the time you'll deal 4 HP of damage, sometimes you'll deal, sometimes they'll have 4 HP left, other times they'll have 5 HP left. It kind of depends on the luck roll, it's just a little bit RNG. The first unit that hard counters tanks is the medium tank. Once your opponent gets enough money to build medium tanks, tanks stops being a viable response. In fact, I've decided to make an additional little simulation here to show just how much tanks struggle against medium tanks. Now, this is the best possible scenario, mind you. This is all the tanks catching the medium tank first and actually getting the first strike. So, the tank costs 7,000 to the medium tank 16,000. So this means that, technically, cost-effective-wise, 3 tanks should be able to deal with a medium tank, but we can actually see that this is not the case. In fact, 3 tanks will not be able to deal cost-effectively with a medium tank at all. And, of course, it depends a little bit on the luck roll. You can do between 1 or 2 points of damage to a medium tank. But you can see right here, this is not a good engagement for the tanks, considering all these units combined actually cost 28,000. So, once you reach a level, I mean, I believe the term that most players use in competitive Advanced Wars is teching up. Once you receive a level of income that allows you to build a medium tank, usually most players would say this is 16,000 income, but it's actually a little bit higher than that, because of course, if you have 3 bases, which is the case in most competitive matchups or most competitive maps, you're not going to be able to just build a medium tank, because that means you have idle bases, and you might also have to take into account repairs and whatnot. So I would say once you get up to like an 18 to 19,000 income in Advanced Wars is where you can comfortably tack up to medium tanks. And at that point, your opponent cannot continue to spam tanks. They will need to either build a medium tank of their own, or they could try to counter the medium tank with artillery or battlecopters, but that is a tricky thing to do and not really that likely to work out. The only way you can counter a medium tank is with a medium tank of your own. So as soon as medium tank enters the fields, that's when tanks start to lose their shine. That doesn't mean they can't be built. They'll still be very useful elsewhere. But medium tanks are very good at zoning out tanks in a big area around them, because tanks just cannot take cost-effective engagements against them. Even if you do things like, say you pop your superpower on max, you're not going to do a lot of damage to medium tanks because your base firepower is just so low. So this is something that is very important to keep in mind. Once medium tanks enter the field, you can no longer rely on tanks to hold your front lines. You'll usually need to build a medium tank of your own. We'll talk a lot more about this in the episode where I eventually get around to talking about medium tanks. Against neo-tanks, it's pretty much the same deal, but it is worth noting that the tanks actually do as much damage to the neo-tanks as they do to the medium tanks. The damage is actually completely similar at 15%. So, in theory, I guess you could say that it's a little bit more effective to attack a neo-tank with a tank over a medium tank, because the neo-tank is just worth a lot more. But the neo-tank also hits back a lot harder, and if you're out in the open, it might even wipe your tank out on the counter-attack, so... If we go in here, of course, this is a little bit luck dependent, because we can do either 1 or 2 HP of damage to the neo-tank. But you can just see that it strikes back so incredibly hard that this doesn't end up being worth it at all. Again, 3 tanks costs 21,000, which is as much as the Neo tank, or almost as much. And you can see that it's not great. And keep in mind, this is the best case scenario. This is me getting to strike first. Most of the time when a Neo tank enters the fray, since it's so fast, it will get to strike the tank first and one-shot it, and then you'll need to strike back at the Neo tank. So yeah, it's not a great engagement for the tanks. I would go so far as to say that the Neo tank and the medium tank hard countered the tank in terms of costs. So this is something you got to keep in mind. Now, against APCs, the tank will deal 75% damage, so tanks cannot one-shot APCs, not even out in the open, only if they have a slight firepower increase. If they catch artillery, they'll do a lot of damage to them. I would say tanks are pretty strong against artillery overall, but you want to be careful. It's not always a guarantee that you want to shoot artillery if you found them out in the open. It seems tempting because the artillery does no damage back, but if there happens to be like 2 tanks in the fog here, and they'll take out your tank, then it's actually not very good to go in for the artillery. Especially not if the artillery is located on a city, which is often the case. Then you won't deal that much damage to it, it's going to get repaired back up, and if you lose your tank in the process, it's not really going to be worth it. So think a little bit ahead if you see an artillery out in the open. It may not always be super cost effective to go in against it with a tank, not if you end up losing your own tank, because it costs slightly more than the artillery. However, if you see a rocket out in the open, you should always take the shot, because the rocket is worth more than twice as much as the tank. So definitely do that. That's like a no-brainer. I would gladly sacrifice a tank any day to take out a rocket or to heavily damage a rocket. Tanks also hard counter artillery pretty well, or sorry, anti-air. Not as much as anti-air counter battlecopters, but they do quite well against them. That doesn't mean anti-air can't take engagements against the tanks. If the tanks are on half health or more, or less, I mean, and the anti-air gets to strike first, they can actually deal with tanks pretty well, but most of the time this is a very good matchup considering the anti-air is actually more expensive than the tank. And if you happen to see missiles out in the open, which is very rare because very few people build missiles, then you should always take the shot as well, because the missiles are worth far more than the tank. Now, in terms of the tank's survivability, infantry don't really do well with tanks at all, as you can see, doing 5% base damage, so they're kind of relying on luck to get any damage done here, which is not great. As we already talked about, mechs do pretty well against tanks, especially if they get to shoot from terrain like forest. Very rarely will mechs take engagement out on roads like this, but it is generally cost effective for them to do so. Recons do about as much as infantry, 1% more base damage, so again, this is not something you'll see unless they're trying to finish off like a 1 HP tank. As I already talked about a little bit with anti-air, anti-air can do slight damage to tanks. They can even do 3 HP of damage if they are lucky. And if you have some kind of firepower increase, you could consider doing this if you have favorable terrain, but it's not really something you want to do. Tank versus tank, we've talked about this a lot, so I'm not going to show it again. Medium tanks cannot one-shot tanks, even out on roads, unless they have a firepower increase, but they still deal with them very effectively. Neo tanks, on the other hand, can. They do 105% base damage, so even on planes, they have a slight chance of one-shotting tanks, which makes them very valuable, because that means they can break through tank-defended lines, which is very nice. In terms of their, wow, look at that, I didn't even scout up my own units. Completely unwatchable, 0 out of 10. Rockets do a lot of damage to tanks, 80%. Although I would say that in most situations, tanks do have the advantage against rockets because of their high mobility. Artillery do 70% damage to tanks. So again, you really don't want to get shot at. I mean, you get the best strategical advice on my channel. And battleships do as much as rockets, doing 80% base damage. But then again, you're not very likely to go up against battleships in competitive advanced wars. Not really something that's going to be happening a lot. So what I want to focus on right now is the tank versus tank matchup. I've already shown what happens if you're out on roads, but a much more common scenario is to meet a tank out on the plains, because tanks are not very, since they don't get any movement bonuses on roads, there's very little reason to move them along roads. In fact, you'd always want to end your tank movement on plains if possible. Even that 10% extra defense you get from the plains are worth it against other tanks, because when tanks attack each other on plains, they do 49% base damage, which means they're far more likely to do 5 HP of damage. So you don't accidentally get another tank bringing you down to 4 HP. So this really helps a lot. It really does. Every HP of your tank is going to matter a lot. However, Will the tank always win when it strikes first? Well, not necessarily. If you meet a tank that is standing on an allied property, you really don't want to attack it. Especially not if you have to attack it from a road. Let's be nice and say that we attack from a plane, which is a far more likely scenario. We'll do 38% base damage to the tank. And as you can see right here, we only do slightly more damage than we take. But the problem is, once it's the opponent's turn, they're gonna get their tank repaired. And then they're gonna get to strike back. So if you have an allied property on your side, it's a very safe place for a tank to take refuge, at least if there's only one other tank in the vicinity. As you can see right here, I attacked first, and yet I am not coming out on top of this engagement. In fact, I'm going to lose it. So whenever you move your tanks out, know that if you can keep your tank on an allied property, it is usually safe there from one other tank. However, if they have two tanks can break through easily, but one tank cannot win the engagement. But what about a tank on a neutral property? Let's attack once again from a plane to make it a little bit more realistic. If you attack a tank situated on a neutral property, then the encounter will be a little bit more even, but I would say that the tank on the property has a slight advantage still. Of course, it depends a little bit on the luck roll. But that defense will start kicking in, and as you can see, of course, once a tank starts getting lower, it will get less benefit from terrain. This is something I've talked a lot about. I haven't mentioned it in an official dedicated video, but I think it is something that most of you will understand at this point, that the lower your HP is, the less defense you get from terrain. But as you can see right here, this encounter is not going as well as you may have thought. Of course, again, it is a little bit luck dependent, and we are attacking from planes. But we can see that it's only barely that I'm able to win here. And if the luck roll went the other way, I probably would have lost. So, pretty much the lesson that I'm trying to impart here is that if you find yourself in a position where you have one tank and the opponent have one tank, if you place your tank on a property, even if it's a neutral one, you'll usually be in a good spot. So these are kind of like safe zones for your tank to take refuge in. And this is good because, of course, in most tank versus tanks matchups, what you'll do is you'll check the range and you'll try to stay out of each other's range because you don't want to get first strike. But if you have a property to move on, you can move on to that property relatively safely, as long as there's not two tanks in range. If there's two tanks in range, then they can attack you quite safely. So just keep this in mind. The next thing I want to talk about is the concept of guarding. This is something that I've talked a little bit about, but it's particularly important in tank versus tank warfare. So here you can see a situation where there are 3 tanks on each side and 3 infantry on each side. For the purposes of this battle, let's pretend like this recon doesn't exist. It's just here to give vision, so it's not really an issue in this battle. So what most people are going to do here is they're going to start capturing properties. But in fact, I'm not going to capture this property. In fact, I'm actually going to leave my tank on this property instead, and I'm going to forgo it for now. Most situations, it probably would be best to cap this property, but I'm just doing this for the purposes of showing something. So, right now, when I place my tanks, it's very important that their ranges overlap. So what I don't want to do, for example, this tank right now is not guarding this tank. Now what I mean by that is if my opponent on their next turn decides to attack this tank will not be in range to attack the other tanks unless this tank moves onto this tile. So what I want to do right now is I want to move my tanks in such a way that they guard each other. So right now this is a pretty good position for this tank right here. It's not in range of this tank, but it guards this tank. So on my opponent's next turn, of course I don't have a recon on this side, so I'm gonna have to actually use my, I guess I'm gonna have to use my my infantry to scout, but that won't really work out either. So, in this situation, so let's say my opponent goes in here, and he takes a shot at my tank, right? Which is bad for me, you know, he gets the first strike, he gets a relatively good luck roll as well. So this is a pretty, likely combat scenario right here. So on my turn, because I was able to guard my tanks, it means that both of these tanks will be getting the first strike on these tanks right here. Because they're within each other's movement range. So even though my opponent technically got the first strike, you can see that I will definitely come out on top on this encounter because I guarded my tanks. Because I placed them in overlapping ranges, so that my other tanks could back up my first tanks. So as you can see right here, this is a situation where I'm definitely winning. On my next turn, my opponent only has 1 healthy tank and 2 very injured ones, and I have a 9 HP tank, an 8 HP tank, and a 5 HP tank. So as you can see right here, I am doing really well here. So once it's my opponent's turn, of course, he will probably decide to do something like this. He'll try to get the best engagement possible. That was a good luck roll too, I think, so he did pretty well in that regard. And then he would most likely try and gang up on my injured tank to try and do as much damage to it as possible. Or potentially he might have pulled back as well, depending on what he wanted to do. But as you can see right here, this is a situation where I will definitely come out on top, even though he got the first strike. So sometimes getting the first strike in Advanced Wars is not everything. Sometimes how you position your tanks is everything. So, you can see here that this is definitely a situation where I will win this engagement. And in fact, because his tanks are so low, I might even start chipping them with infantry of my own just to finish them off. Like, for example, this infantry right here can move in, and if I get a good luck roll, which I got here, I can completely finish off this tank. And so even though both of us started out with relatively, or actually exactly the same units, I'm actually not going to use this recon because I said it wouldn't matter. You can see that this has completely snowballed in my direction. Now my opponent has no tanks left, and I have a 6 HP tank, a 5 HP tank, and a 2 HP tank. So this one definitely goes to me. If this was a competitive match of Advanced Wars, I would have won this match by now. 9 out of 10 times, unless I threw it terribly. So as you can see, the tank versus tank matchup is extremely important. Always make sure to guard your tanks, place them in range of each other, don't move a tank out in complete isolation, or else it's just gonna get picked off. So that is the essence of tank versus tank gameplay. There's a lot more to it than that, obviously. These are just the basics of tank versus tank, but I hope that this gave you a good idea of how to utilize them. You always want to build tanks in the early game, and then eventually, of course, you want to tech up the medium tanks and then eventually neo tanks. But if you can get the early game nailed down, you're going to be winning most of your matches, unless your opponent is extremely skilled. So anyway, guys, let me know if you enjoyed this episode. What do you think about tanks? Do you think they're the perfect unit, or do you wish they'd be changed in some way? I do believe they are pretty much unchanged between all the Advanced Wars games. I think it's the one unit that has basically never been changed. I can't speak for Days of Ruin in great detail, because that's not a game I know a lot about, but in all the other games, the tanks are pretty much unchanged. So anyway, guys, let me know what unit you would like to see me cover next. Like, comment, subscribe for more Advanced Wars content, and I will see you guys next time. Bye-bye.